2018 marked the 17th anniversary of the 9/11 terrorist attack on the World Trade Center in New York City, along with the attack on the Pentagon and the downing of United Flight 93. Nearly 3,000 people died in these attacks, and it remains today the most devastating modern terrorist attack to ever take place in the United States. Because of the severity of this event, as well as its subsequent launching of the War on Terror, many conspiracy theories began to circulate around it. These conspiracy theories range from Nostradamus and the Mayans predicting 9/11 to the belief that the United States played some part in orchestrating the terrorist attack. Because no one really knows the whole truth, Top 5 has covered all aspects of what happened that day, from the heroes to the conspiracy theories, and so we can give a balanced view. In this video, we're going to look at some of the popular conspiracy theories and why many believe they are nonsense. Again, we are not saying we believe or disbelieve these 5 conspiracies, but in order to make valid arguments, especially on such a sensitive topic, then we need to cover all angles and look at both sides. After all, if a conspiracy theory really does hold weight, then it should be able to stand up to any scrutiny. Let's begin. The Wingdings secret message. There are many theories that suggest that some sort of sign or prior knowledge was present about the 9/11 terrorist attacks. These theories range in scope from ancient philosopher Nostradamus predicting them, to the idea that the United States government may have had early intelligence about the attack that they ignored. While most of these have already been proven false, one of the most fascinating and incredible theories, suggested by some, is that the 9/11 terrorist attacks were predicted by the font pack Wingdings. Wingdings was a font pack developed by Microsoft in 1990. It's part of a subset of fonts known as dingbat fonts, which are primarily utilised to ornament papers and publications. Characters were randomly assigned to the different keys on the keyboard to act as a grab bag of symbols that could be utilised on a Microsoft Word document, while the key a symbol was associated with had absolutely no relation to the letter value whatsoever. The first conspiracy theory about this font came as users discovered what would happen if you typed NYC using it. A skull and crossbones, a Star of David, and a thumbs up symbol would appear in sequence, which many claimed was an intentional anti-Semitic inclusion on the part of Microsoft. Even though the sequence was randomly programmed, this conspiracy theory led to an investigation by the Defamation League and caused Microsoft to purposely program a glyph message of I love city for NYC into the 1997 Wingdings font. However, this only temporarily ended the scandal for Microsoft. When the 9/11 terrorist attacks came by, a viral hoax was created surrounding the font Wingdings once again. It claimed that the sequence Q33NY was one of the flight numbers of a plane that crashed into the World Trade Center. And if you typed that sequence into Wingdings, you would find a plane, 2 boxes that looked vaguely like the Twin Towers, and the skull and crossbones, with the Star of David. This led to many wild accusations and theories about this cryptic meaning, dredging up more controversy from this outdated font. This conspiracy theory was incorrect from the start, as Q33NY was not a flight number for any of the planes involved in the 9/11 attacks. Microsoft, once again, had to put out a statement about the font, saying that it was unfortunate that such a false connection was being made in the wake of such a tragic and serious event. Since the creation of that hoax, this myth is circulated every year by many 9/11 truthers, with some going further to try and legitimize the reason behind the code for this sequence is Q33NY, by adding up flight numbers and even tower shapes to somehow arrive at the number 33. Hardcore conspiracy theorists may still try to convince you that this particular sequence in some way predicted the events of 9/11. However, as Microsoft has stated multiple times, this sequence is nothing more than a random array of letters with no relation or significance whatsoever to the tragic events of 9/11. Planes are missiles. 4 commercial airline flights were involved in the 9/11 terrorist attacks. The 2 planes that struck the Twin Towers in New York were American Airlines Flight 11 carrying 92 people, and United Airlines Flight 175 carrying 65 people. American Airlines Flight 77, carrying 64 people, crashed into the Pentagon, and United Airlines Flight 93, carrying 44 passengers, was forcibly crashed by a brave group of passengers who overpowered the terrorists on the plane. However, according to some 9/11 truthers, these planes were not filled with any passengers whatsoever, and might not have been planes at all. A number of conspiracy theorists believe in what is referred to as the no planes theory, which is exactly as it sounds. These theorists believe that the planes were actually cruise missiles designed to target the buildings they struck, and that any eyewitness account of these planes crashing, whether video or from the naked eye, was faked or some kind of illusion. Truthers often cite a few reasons for these claims. Firstly, they believe that the velocity of materials of the planes was not enough to generate as much destructive power on the World Trade Center and Pentagon as they did, meaning some other means of exploding the building had to have been used. Secondly, they cite the way a cruise missile sounds compared to the way a jet engine sounds, and the sounds heard on 9/11. Take a listen to this soundbite posted by one such individual. Third, they note that the hole made from the plane that allegedly struck the Pentagon was too small to have been made by a plane, and even that there were no plane parts found at the crash site. Of course, none of these claims provide any substantial proof, and to most people would be seen as beyond far-fetched. The velocity, heat, and explosive power of the planes was more than enough to weaken the support of the towers, as was both witnessed and scientifically documented in multiple simulations and reports done after the crash. The similarities of sound between a cruise missile and a jet engine comes from the disruption of air that each object has by travelling at that speed through the air, and the sounds that the planes made sound just like any other plane travelling at high velocity. Thirdly, the crash site was well documented at the Pentagon, with many plane parts strewn about the vicinity, and distinct wing-shaped holes in the building that the plane crashed through. These same holes can be seen as the planes crash into the Twin Towers. With so many eyewitness accounts of these planes, as well as the air traffic control audio of the planes being monitored and communicated with, it seems next to impossible to have faked something this complex. Additionally, all 265 people on these planes bought and had tickets for these flight numbers and were subsequently killed. The airline companies with these planes had to assess damages and were obviously missing these planes from their fleets after these events. It would be quite a stretch, even for a force as powerful as the government, to individually kill and cover up the deaths of 265 people, as well as to hide 2 planes and fake billions of dollars in property damage claims. With all the recorded and documented evidence on the contrary to this missile theory, it's safe to say that this conspiracy theory is pretty far-fetched. The Pentagon explosion was staged. While there is extensive video evidence depicting the crashes of 2 commercial jetliner planes into the World Trade Center towers, the same cannot be said for the crash at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. No footage from any eyewitness has ever been released to the public, and the only footage that does exist is security camera footage from 2 different angles on the Pentagon's premises, which was released to the public in July of 2015. Because of the nature of the security camera footage, only showing a single frame of the plane impacting the ground before a massive explosion, and the relative lack of reliable eyewitness footage confirming the crash of American Airlines Flight 77, many truthers believe that the Pentagon was not struck by a plane at all, and instead the explosion was staged by the US government. This theory goes hand in hand with those that believe that the government was also involved in the World Trade Center attacks, which we will discuss later on. Theorists cite a multitude of reasons for why they believe the Pentagon attack was actually a staged bombing, rather than a plane crash. The biggest reason is the size of the impact site, which was right between corridors 4 and 5. This impact site was 60 feet wide, reaching deep into the Pentagon, damaging the building all the way up to the B-wing. However, the plane itself had a wingspan of 125 feet, leaving many conspiracy theorists to question how it was possible that such a small hole had been made. Additionally, the immediate lack of video evidence available to the public also made truthers who were not on the scene skeptical that the event had even taken place, and that eyewitness accounts had been faked or influenced in some way. Thirdly, many truthers claimed that the plane wreckage and passenger remains were not found, citing a quote from the Washington County Fire Chief, who said upon initial review, "First of all, the question about the aircraft. There are some small pieces of aircraft visible from the interior during this firefighting operation I'm talking about, but not large sections. In other words, there's no fuselage sections, and that sort of thing. Believers claim that instead of a plane striking the Pentagon, either a missile struck it or bombs were planted somewhere on the grounds of the Pentagon itself. However, a look into the facts of the matter and the accuracy of these claims reveals just how quickly this conspiracy theory breaks down. Right before the attack on the Pentagon took place, the wedge that the plane struck, Wedge 1, had just undergone extensive upgrades in physical protection. The exterior walls had just recently been reinforced with steel beams strongly secured together, as well as thicker cement walls on the interior wings. Often referred to as the miracle of the Pentagon, the plane crashing into this wedge was probably the safest possible place for it to have landed. When the plane hit the building, the wings bent inwards due to the strong structural support, and the fact that the plane had hit the ground prior to hitting the building slowed its momentum. This accounts for the small impact hole. Damage was still very extensive, with damage reaching 4 of the 5 wings in Wedge 1. While the public has only been able to see a few pieces of video evidence, this is simply because much of the video surveillance information is classified. More will likely be released to the public in the years to come, and that's not to mention the vast number of eyewitness accounts who saw the plane hitting the ground and ramming into the Pentagon. Finally, the fire chief's statement, cited here, is only half complete. He goes on to say, "You know, I'd rather not comment on that. We have a lot of eyewitnesses that can give you better information about what exactly happened with the aircraft as it approached. So we don't know. I don't know." At the time, the fire chief had just arrived at the scene and was still assessing damage. Both aeroplane fuselage, as well as disembodied limbs and human remains, were found scattered around the crash site, and unfortunately can be seen on some disturbing photographs. This horrific damage is further proof that the commercial airline did indeed crash into the Pentagon, and that these conspiracy theorists are preying off initial ambiguities of the crash itself. Building 7's collapse. While many people are aware of the destruction of Towers 1 and 2 at the World Trade Center in New York, the destruction of World Trade Center Tower 7 is much less known. The building is often seen as critical evidence by 9/11 conspiracy theorists that there was some sort of government involvement in the tragedies of the day. Tower 7 was located immediately north of the World Trade Center main complex and held a number of relative operations that supported the business and security dealings of the World Trade Center. Not many tenants occupied this building, though Mayor Giuliani had base fuel and energy components for World Trade Center in this tower. Conspiracy theorists cite 2 pieces of evidence that they believe shows that Tower 7 was not destroyed by terrorists, and that 9/11 as a whole may have been staged. First, they cite the fact that Tower 7's collapse about 7 hours after Towers 1 and 2 fell. The North Tower collapsed at 10:28 AM EST, and Tower 7 didn't end up collapsing until 5:20 EST later that day. The delayed collapse in the wake of the destruction of Towers 1 and 2 made some suspicious, thinking that perhaps this demolition was meant to be hidden and out of the public eye. To add to this, theorists cite the supposed appearance of Tower 7's collapse, as it looked very much like a controlled demolition. Fires and sparks came from inside the building throughout the afternoon, and from the outside on the ground, it appeared as if charges might have been going off inside the building. Conspiracy theorists say that the building fell to the ground neatly, impacting very few of its surroundings, and with this building not being hit directly by the planes, it seems incredibly suspicious that Tower 7 would collapse at all. For these reasons, many believe that bombs must have been planted and that Tower 7's collapse was a controlled demolition. However, although many people act like there are mysterious circumstances surrounding the collapse of Tower 7, in reality, its collapse and the way by which it fell is actually very well documented and observed. Police and fire teams on the scene followed the building throughout the afternoon, observing its slow but steady process of destruction. After the north tower of the main World Trade Center complex collapsed, extensive fiery and heavy debris rained down onto Tower 7, which was right next to the north tower. This debris caused severe damage to the building, causing several fires and damaging the structural integrity of the building itself. Fires raged through many floors of the building, but not from the outside. These fires were not clearly visible. On floors 7, 8, 9, 11, 12 and 13, sprinkler systems designed to put out the fires failed, meaning these fires burned out of control and caused intensive damage to the structure of the building. Around 3:30 PM in the afternoon, the damage became so extensive and known to the firefighters attempting to halt these fires and rescue civilians trapped in the building that they evacuated the grounds entirely. These firefighters were aware 2 hours beforehand that the structural integrity of the building was in jeopardy, and the building and area surrounding it was completely evacuated of all persons to avoid injury. The evidence of structural problems was actually clear around an hour earlier when firefighters on the scene saw a bulge forming between the 10th and 13th floors of the building, suggestive of an impending collapse. Column 79, connected to the 13th floor and a critical column support for Tower 7, began to sustain intense damage with the raging fires around it, and began to buckle under the strain and weight. This commenced what is known as a progressive collapse, meaning the rest of the supporting columns gradually began to give way under the weight of the rest of the building. The interior of the building actually collapsed up to 1 minute before the entire structure came down, as the fires and damage around floor 13 caused all floors above to collapse down to the 5th floor. After this took place, the rest of Tower 7 fell to the ground. An extensive report was conducted by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which was released in 2017, and concluded these findings. This comprehensive study, along with the accounts and reports of firefighters on the scene that day, provides conclusive proof that these debris fires were the primary cause of the building's collapse. Jet fuel can't melt steel beams. The most infamous and well-known theory about the 9/11 terrorist attacks is that the attacks on the World Trade Center were staged. The main evidence cited for this is that it seems that more than 2 commercial-class jetliners would be needed to take down such massive structures. People commonly cite the melting point of processed steel beams, which sits around 2,500 degrees centigrade, and the fact that jet fuel burns at between 800 and 1,500 degrees. Because of this, people famously state that jet fuel can't melt steel beams, and believe that some sort of other detonating force was necessary in order to collapse the 2 towers. This theory is so well known that it spawned a viral meme, using the phrase "jet fuel can't melt steel beams" and repurposing it in a variety of contexts. These conspiracy theorists also cite suspicious activities by the United States government that appear to indicate that they had some sort of involvement in the execution of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Many believe that there was some sort of prior knowledge of the attacks that the United States government kept quiet from the people. Suspiciously, high amounts of stock trading for United and American Airlines stock in the days leading up to 9/11 made some suspect that insiders in the government and in terrorist groups had been trading stocks to profit off these attacks. Finally, truthers cite the lack of military interception of these commercial airliners as a reason that the United States staged and orchestrated these attacks. While the attacks were taking place, it was noticed that the president was miles away visiting a school in Florida. The fact that fighter jets did not take down the commercial jetliners or find them in time leads some people to believe that the NORAD was purposefully told to stand down while these attacks took place. This has also spawned a series of viral memes surrounding the conspiracy that Bush did 9/11. First and foremost, jet fuel may not be able to melt steel beams, but is certainly able to weaken them. A massive investigation engaged by NIST concluded that the building's structural integrity had been compromised when the planes crashed into the towers. The impacts sliced through many supportive structures, closed off certain security ducts, meant to abate fires and cause fires to spread across the tower itself. Once the fires began spreading and heating the support structure, the already weakened supports collapsed from the weight of the tower being supported above the site of impact, causing the rest of the structure to topple. Although conspiracy theorists claim thermite, an explosive chemical residue found in the debris of the building, the actual analysis found this to be false, and what truthers thought was thermite was actually paint primer melted and shredded off the buildings themselves. Furthermore, extensive amounts of thermite would have been necessary to detonate and destroy the building in the way proposed by truthers, which would not have been able to have been hidden. These reports have been corroborated by several independent studies as well as an official government review. As for the unusual trading, most of the abnormally large amounts of trades came from a single buyer with no connections whatsoever to Al-Qaeda, and that this trading strategy actually involved buying stocks from American Airlines and trading some from United, rather than buying and short-selling stocks. The FBI did a thorough investigation given the outward appearance of these happenings. So although unusual trading activity did occur, it was traced to an entirely innocuous source. Finally comes the question of NORAD, and the solution comes from understanding how our military and aviation bureaucracy functioned in 2001. Hollywood depictions of military operations have made it seem as if the government knows everything that is happening the second it takes place. However, at the time of the attacks, the first people who found out about these plane hijackings were those of the FAA of the time. There was no direct line of communication between NORAD and civilian air traffic control, meaning the FAA had to literally phone up NORAD to notify them of the attacks. This lack of streamlining, combined with the fact that a major American commercial plane hijacking hadn't taken place since 1978, caused notifications to be heavily delayed between the FAA and NORAD. The hijackers also turned off their transponders, which made it extremely difficult at the time for NORAD and the FAA to have tracked the flights via radar. NORAD only had 8 minutes warning for American Airlines Flight 11, which crashed into the North Tower, and even less for every other flight. They were informed of Flight 77's hijacking just 3 minutes before it hit the Pentagon, of Flight 175 right as it struck the South Tower, and of Flight 93 3 minutes after it had crashed in Pennsylvania. Even with a good window of information, fighter jets would likely not have reached the airliners in time, as there was a ban on flying at supersonic speeds within domestic borders, even for interceptions. With all these factors combined, it should be clear beyond a reasonable doubt that 9/11 was most likely not a staged event, but instead a great tragedy that showed just how vulnerable the United States could be in the face of a domestic attack. These attacks led to increased security and streamlining measures, including NORAD's collaboration with the FAA, the changing of intercept rules, and the creation of an entirely new branch of national government, the Department of Homeland Security. Many conspiracy theories flourish within our gaps of knowledge, but when it comes to 9/11, the American people have done extensive research for the real and whole truth, to make sure a tragedy like this does not happen again. Now again, I'd like to say that we are not saying we believe or disbelieve in these conspiracies. We are simply presenting evidence to suggest that the 5 most common 9/11 conspiracy theories may not be as true on the surface as it seems. But again, that does not mean that all the conspiracy theories surrounding 9/11 are not true, and that everything we have been told was the truth. Like I said, the true conspiracies should be able to stand up to any scrutiny, and if they do not, then we certainly cannot say that they're true. The conspiracies that do stand up to scrutiny, now those are the ones that we should be focusing on and putting